Hi, everybody. Welcome to Eagle Point Funding's free webinar on federal funding for cybersecurity R&D. We're going to be touching on a number of subjects. Particularly, we're going to be taking an overview look at what federal funding looks like for R&D in federal or fiscal year 2018. And then we're going to take a more in-depth look at what it looks for cybersecurity companies that are conducting R&D. I'm Josh Barone. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Eagle Point Funding. I'm joined today with our Chief Analyst, Uriel Bar-Oz. I will be giving a little bit more of an overview about federal funding as a whole. We'll be touching briefly on how the federal agencies approach cybersecurity and general budgets. And Uriel is going to take us through a number of prime examples of current broad agency announcements. That is the federal agency's way of posting new opportunities for R&D investments from the federal government, as well as some that have passed, and to get a good idea about what those budgets looked like, what were the interesting topics, in order to get a more firm understanding of the way R&D grants work for cybersecurity companies. So I think the question I get asked most frequently when we're talking about the federal budget is, how much money is actually available? And the number may surprise you. In fact, it's surprised the federal government themselves, because they had slotted only $151 billion only, of course, for the federal budget for all R&D related issues in 2018, all R&D projects. This includes early and basic research as well as applied research, with the majority falling on the basic early side research. However, something drastic happened in a later stage than expected as well. And the budget was passed on March 23rd, 6 months past the deadline. And the budget was $176.8 billion. That's the amount of federal funding available in fiscal year 2018 for R&D projects. And that's obviously an enormous amount of money. That money doesn't all go to the private industry, but a significant chunk of it does. We know in past years, this chart that we have on the slide shows up in 2016, where roughly $60 billion was going to the private industry. Realistically, we don't have updated results on what's going on in fiscal year 2017 or 2018, but with the increased budget, more than 20 billion more than was expected, we can make a wise assessment saying there's likely even more than $60 billion available for the private industry. I think if you look at how the budget relates to cybersecurity, you see that in 2017, the federal government was already investing enormous amounts in cybersecurity, $13.1 billion. And in fiscal year 2018, that number has swelled to 14.4 billion, and it's only going to continue going up and up. These numbers relate to the federal investment in both R&D as well as procurement in the form of contracts. But we have a firm understanding that literally billions of dollars are being invested by the federal government on cybersecurity matters. And it's not surprising. None of us are surprised by this, because the government already posted not so long ago that in 2016, the U.S. economy suffered losses of somewhere between 57 billion and 109 billion. So we know of the cost of cybersecurity attacks on the U.S. economy. We also know, light of rumors of Russian tampering in the elections, and other, WikiLeaks and other types of cybersecurity breaches, which have troubled either directly the federal government or U.S. companies or institutions. So the concept of cybersecurity is a very hot topic for all federal agencies. In fact, if I step aside from our slide for a second and I look at what's going on in the different federal agencies, we know that pretty much every agency has a strategy when it comes to cybersecurity. This is posted in May 15th, earlier this month, from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It's It's a long document detailing what the Homeland Security Department wants to do, and including what type of investments they want to make in R&D long term. We see it here with the U.S. Department of Energy has a multi-plan for energy sector. This was published in March, so just a few months ago. And the DoD, the Department of Defense, also has a cybersecurity strategy. In fact, if you want to know more about the different spending, this only takes us up to 2016, but you can check the different in this database here and see how each agency, literally each agency, has a cybersecurity budget, which includes procurement, contracts, like I mentioned, and R&D investments. So we know that there is certainly a strong interest in cybersecurity, and that the federal government is investing billions of dollars in cybersecurity R&D. Let's take another example and use some more concrete data. If we look at DARPA, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's a sub-agency of the Department of Defense, and it was actually an interesting institution in that it was formed under Kennedy's term as president, where after the launch of Sputnik, the federal government realized that they need to make more efforts to ensure that the U.S. has a technological superiority to its neighboring countries and countries that are not neighboring. And we know that the budget for cyber R&D in DARPA is $41.2 million. And that's a sub-agency. That's a sub-agency. It's not even its own agency itself. And that was roughly 10% of DARPA's R&D budget was allocated to cybersecurity. And this does not include classified projects. And to quote a paper also relating to the DARPA's approach to cybersecurity, the investment in basic research historically spurred innovation by the private sector. In other words, the federal government looks at the private sector in a number of lenses. One is a sector which could provide innovative solutions, which could give solutions to the federal agencies themselves, whether it's on a defense stage or supporting the agencies themselves and the government and their different departments, or just to create an advancement of technology. And maybe we'll get into that a little bit now when we look at the difference between dilutive and non-dilutive funding and why the federal government does it. So what are the typical sources of funding? We have venture capital, we all know that, angel investors, similar, and bank loans, different ways to fund your company. And what all of these dilutive funding sources have in common is there's always a transfer of equity, and it often comes with advisors or additional board members, and at times a sacrifice of your intellectual property. Not the case with non-dilutive funding, which federal grants or family members are pretty much the only two sources of non-dilutive funding, where there is zero equity transfer. The federal government is investing in your company over the long term and not expecting to receive any royalties back or any other transfer of control or have any outside interference by additional board members. And the federal government is encouraging you to maintain IP rights. And the crazy thing about federal grants is their value goes far beyond the dollar amount that you receive from the federal agency that is investing in your R&D. This is an interesting study produced by the Milken Institute in 2012, where they found that for every dollar the federal agencies invested in private R&D, those companies were able to generate $8.38 in private sector investments over the 8 years, more than an eightfold investment. Why? Because federal grants are viewed by investors as the hallmark of quality, the stamp of approval. If the federal agencies are investing in your technology, then for sure the private sector is going to want to do so as well, because they know you've already been approved by the highest level of approval. So why does the government do it? Well, they do it because they want to advance knowledge and technology as a whole. The idea is by promoting by promoting your R&D, they could be improving the society and what's available for U.S. citizens as well as global citizens. In fact, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, there's an interest to have cooperative investments in companies that are not U.S. based. But on a local side of things, we also know that a strong industry leads to a strong economy and improved quality of life for U.S. citizens. I mentioned before the cost of cyber attacks to the American economy, but beyond the desire to protect the economy and to protect U.S. citizens and to improve quality of life and advance technology, the federal government also has an economic incentive here. They found, and this is also from that same Milken Institute study, that for every dollar the federal agencies invest in you, the federal government receives $2.30 back on investment. And this is by job creation and creating jobs, and also by receiving taxes. When you're a R&D company and you're going to create a product and you're going to go to market with that product, then you're going to sell it, and the government's going to have taxes that they receive on every sale. And that is classic ROI, investment, and trickle-down economics. So basically, we know that there's a tremendous amount of money. There are billions upon billions of dollars. We know that the investment, the investment that you receive long term pales the initial investment that you receive. So why is not every company approaching federal grants in swarms? And I think what we found in our experience is that there are two primary challenges when it comes to applying for federal grants. The first is they're hard to identify. It's hard to identify the opportunities because we're talking about 25 federal agencies that have very large R&D budgets, and there's no one clear central hub that takes care of all of the different opportunities. And even though there is, it's very difficult to sift through and find. And whatever you are finding, and this relates to the second point, chances are many other companies have already identified those opportunities that you found, and a sort of shallow approach, and therefore you're up against a lot of competition, and your success rate is pretty low because of the competition, and also because of a bunch of technical failures along the way when it comes to the bureaucratic measures of applying for federal grants. So what we found to be a very successful formula towards approaching federal grants is, first and foremost, you need to know the federal system. There are agency papers. I was just showing you guys a couple of different agency papers on cybersecurity as a detailed strategy over the next couple of years. So that's one way to look there and to have an understanding of what each agency is looking for. But you also need to know what's received funding already, who are the principal officers involved in each bid. You also need to know to clarify your vision and capabilities. You need to have an R&D map which looks into the distant future, whether distant for you is 1 or 2 or 3 years, but to actually be thinking a couple steps ahead. Afterwards, you need to not identify one opportunity that matches your R&D vision, but you need to find multiple opportunities. And that's where it leads to the fourth and perhaps most important, is to engage in a long-term multi-submission strategy. This means that never is it going to be okay to apply for one grant. You want to apply for many grants in order to maximize your chance of receiving a high-level award. Just a little bit about us. You know who's talking to you today. Eagle Point Funding is the biggest consulting firm of its kind, specialized in non-dilutive funding. We're just on our 20th year, or 21st year, where we have 70 plus full-time employees and over 250 active clients. We mentioned the low per submission success rate. We found that with our formula and with our experience that we're more than tripling those success rates, between 25 to 30% per grant submission success rate, but that's not enough. And this is why we talk about a multi-submission strategy. And with that multi-submission strategy, we have a success rate of at least 64% of our clients receive at least one grant per year. And this long-term approach has led to over $1.5 billion in awards to date and roughly $70 million annually. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you Oriel Bar-Oz, our chief analyst, so we can talk a little bit more in detail about cybersecurity opportunities for R&D. Hi, Oriel.
Hi, Josh, and hello to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on this cybersecurity webinar. Thank you, Josh, for that introduction and overview. I will now take everyone on a very short tour in which I'll try to drill down a bit further into the technicalities and what's actually on offer in terms of federal funding and broad agency announcements, and how it's done, how it's been done so far, and how it's going to look into the future. So first, what you can see right now on your screen is the list of the primary agencies interested in cyber and R&D. Now, when considering a cyber, for instance, cyber defense or cyber attack capabilities, most of you may think naturally about the DoD, the Department of Defense, who is most likely to be interested in such solutions. However, if you only think about the DoD, which is probably the natural thing to do, you might miss out on many other opportunities, because the 8 agencies you see currently on the screen, including NASA and the National Science Foundation, NSF, also the DOE and others, they are all interested in financing R&D, especially in cybersecurity. So it does take some skill to locate the actual relevant offers from these agencies, but they do exist. Now, which one of these would you say has the largest amount of available funding, or the smallest amount? You could take a minute to think about that, but you can see on the screen right now a little short breakdown. The DHS has just over $840 million on the table just for R&D, as an R&D budget waiting to be used, among other things, to support new technology such as the ones on offer. The NIST has $1.2 billion. NASA has just over $6 billion. The DOE as well, NSF, has almost $8 billion. And well, it could be expected. The DoD, it's no big surprise, has almost $15 billion in R&D budgets. And as Josh mentioned before, and I just repeated myself, not all of this is meant for supporting, for using grants, but a substantial amount is. It is tough to get a good sense of the current budget for cyber security R&D. But we do know from numbers that the agencies publish themselves, moving along, that the DoD has just over $8 billion for cybersecurity in spending alone. This includes non-classified subjects only. Plus, it's worth mentioning that this number was relevant prior to the omnibus change. So from what we've seen so far, the numbers are even larger than what you see on the screen right now. Now, it's not just R&D. It's a total budget for lots of different things, but a large amount is set aside for grants alone, which are used for leveraging companies onward. So, what are currently the primary areas of interest for cyber R&D? Now, please make a note that we're mentioning only the primary areas right now. Don't be alarmed if you don't specifically see yourself in one of the points on this slide or the next, because most BAAs, most broad agency announcements, are very, very wide, at times quite fuzzy, intentionally so, So what we've done is try to analyze what it is they're specifically interested in. But again, if you don't see yourself specifically here, it still doesn't mean you cannot apply. So what can we see on the screen? Threat assessment goes without saying. Offensive tools is also something that most companies and most individuals in the cybersecurity arena will think about themselves. But situational awareness, developing and applying different tools and techniques for developing situational awareness, either automatically, autonomously, or manually. Digital forensics for back analysis. Also, command and control tools are very, very relevant. Next, what else we found? Data protection solutions, data analytics and tools, data visualization, AI, almost anything you can think about in the scope of cybersecurity will fit into at least one agency's spectrum of offers on the table. So, like we mentioned before, you do not have to limit yourself to one agency or the other. You'd be surprised to find which agencies are actually interested in very advanced cybersecurity solutions. Now, it's very important to mention at this stage that the agencies are all interested in revolutionary technology, not evolutionary technology. What that means is they would like to see new R&D, new research and development being done. They are not interested in supporting manufacturing. They're not interested in commercialization. These grants are meant for finding new areas of advanced and innovative research and development in which other companies have not yet been successful. Integration is sometimes a gray area. It depends. In some cases, they do support integration, especially if it's very complex and difficult and has not been done before. But in all cases, these grants are meant for innovative solutions. So this is a very important point to make early in the process. In other words, if you've already completed your R&D processes, these federal grants are probably not for you. Okay, so moving along, I'll take you on a short tour of a few examples of some current broad agency announcements. Now, take notice, broad agency announcements are the name given by the agencies themselves, and they are what they say they are. This is exactly what they mean. At times, the agencies themselves are not quite sure what kind of information, what kind of solutions and tools and companies are out there, and thus they employ a broad agency announcement, meaning, as I said before, it's quite general and fuzzy at times. They are not quite sure what they're looking for themselves. So they reach out with these broad agency announcements, the BAAs, and try to see what comes up the fishing line, so to speak, and what kind of companies come back to them with their solutions. What you should take as companies considering moving into this arena are three major things. First of all, you have to take into account your technological relevance for the grant. When approaching a grant, you have to make sure that your current or future technology matches with what the BAA and what the agency is looking for. Don't try to manipulate yourself too much, because you'll end up stuck in a corner and not being able to release yourself. So don't dig yourself a hole you cannot climb out of later. Second is budget. You have to take into account that different calls, different opportunities offer very, very different levels of support, ranging from several tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars up to several millions of dollars. So you have to make sure what are the budgetary needs of your company, and also take that into account. And last but not least are deadlines. Each BAA has a deadline for submission. Some of them have a two-step submission process, some single step, some span over 5 years, and some are only open for several months. So you have to consider the workload you have in the company at the moment, and if you have the available personnel and time to invest in writing a white paper and later a full submission. So again, the three things you have to take into account as a company when approaching these announcements are the technological relevance, the budgetary needs, and the deadlines. Now, onto the example on the screen right now. The NSF is seeking to advance R&D and practical use of what you can see on the screen, generally speaking, next-gen math, novel algorithms, experimental groundbreaking ideas, also some interface solutions. Next, another example is by the Air Force. Now, the Air Force operates under the DoD, so as I mentioned before, it makes sense that the DoD would be interested in cybersecurity. But when thinking about the Air Force, most people would think about planes and maybe aircraft carriers and not much more. So to answer your unasked question, yes, the Air Force is definitely interested directly in our cybersecurity tools, solutions, and products in all kinds of fields, such as secure command and control methods, supervisory control and data, web vulnerabilities and cyber situational awareness, as we mentioned before, SCADA solutions for SCADA protection, jam resistance, and others. So this is already an example of an agency that is not to be taken for granted for its interest in cyber solutions. And moving on to the third and last example for this time, the DOE. Who would thunk it, as they say? The DOE itself is directly interested in cybersecurity solutions. As you can see, specifically, we brought you an example of cybersecurity for infrastructure of electric vehicle charging. The US is interested in building vast infrastructure for the charging of electric vehicles, and all of this infrastructure requires a lot of protection from the cyber level as well. Now, we brought you this example for several reasons. First of all, because it doesn't necessarily come to mind that the DOE would be interested in this. Secondly, because you can see quite clearly on the screen, this was a very detailed announcement, so it shows the minimum and maximum amounts of support between 1 million and up to 5 million. This is quite a substantial amount of money, especially for small companies. And lastly, this is fresh from the oven, and this wasn't published too long ago. And actually, last date for submission is today, as you can see on the screen, May 30th. So I'm guessing no one's is going to be able to submit for, to this one anymore. But new announcements come out daily, several tens of them, and we stay updated as possible. But there are always new opportunities on the table. So this was a very short overview and with some additional examples to show you the relevance and some more information about what's on offer and what's on the table. It's worth mentioning that most grants are for long-term R&D, that is 12 to 36 months of development. That means looking into the future. So any company that has relevant R&D plans should definitely make use of this opportunity and receive some funds from the federal government. Why not? So I'll now give the stage back to Josh, and we'll have a short Q&A session and see what comes up. I think we have some questions from the audience. Let's see what we can do with that.
Awesome, excellent. So actually, maybe first, I have a couple questions for you, Oriel, as well. But now is a great opportunity. You can put your questions in your question box, as I see a few of you already have. So I mean, Oriel, you mentioned about what the federal government is not looking for. You said they're not looking for technology that's not revolutionary or Me Too, I guess, technology. Can you tell me a little bit more about what they actually are looking for? What is a good classification of a company that has a good chance of receiving a federal grant?
Okay, so that's a very good question. We actually I get asked that question a lot. You have to try to look into what it is the company wants to do. If you've already completed your R&D or are about to complete the R&D process, meaning you only have some productization processes to go through, or you're about to initiate the pilot phase and so on, then that probably means you will not qualify for this type of grants. What you do need to do in order to qualify is make sure that you have a lot of R&D work ahead of you, something substantial to hold at least 12 months of R&D work. Plus, make sure that it's innovative. It's not something that's been done before. It's something new, and in that case, in most cases, if that's your status, you're definitely going to be eligible for at least some support from the federal government.
Awesome, wonderful. Thank you very much. Maybe you could talk a little bit. I see we have a question from the audience of whether or not foreign nationals from any country are allowed to work on federal military grants.
So the short answer is yes. It does depend on a case-by-case scenario. Some grants don't allow that at all. Some allow some of it. It depends on the breakdown of, in most cases, the breakdown of ownership of the company. Plus, if it has a subsidiary in the U.S., in most cases, that's enough. Also, there are sometimes some limitations on the use of outside contractors, but in most cases, either it is completely allowed or there is some workaround in order to facilitate the support, even if you are a foreign entity. Also, it's worth mentioning that there are even some agencies, some opportunities, some BAAs that are specifically meant for foreign entities. So this is definitely not a US only type of program.
Okay, we have another question here asking, what is the average size of a grant? So I'll answer that one. The average size of a grant is usually roughly around $1 million, where it depends on whether or not you're going for an SBIR or a BAA. BAAs typically, which are the majority of the budget, have a larger ceiling. The largest BAA that we've ever received for a client to date was 60 million. So you see that it can get quite large for really any size company. But it depends on your budget. So if you have a budget which is of $50,000, then an expense is only of $50,000, and the max grant that you're going to receive isn't going to be much beyond that. However, if you have a large budget of 20, 30, 40 million dollars, or $2 or $3 or $4 million, then that is going to be the maximum size of grant that you're going to receive. Okay, anybody have any more questions? I see another question just added. Does team size matter, and does startup need to generate revenue? No, it does not matter. The size of the team is not going to be is not relevant as long as you have capable investigators, researchers, developers on your team. That's what the government is looking for. They want to invest in technology over the long term, which has a large chance of being successful. So if you have a history of successful projects in the past, or you have the other sorts of credentials, being a researcher, maybe from either from academia or from private industry, then you have a good chance. And whether or not you need to generate revenue, Not necessarily. I mean, you need to probably have the ability to wait for the time that it's going to take to receive a grant, but you don't necessarily need to have revenue before starting going for a federal grant. And let me see if there are any other questions. Sorry. Do you need a governmental customer to demonstrate interest in the development you may conduct? Uriel, do you want to take that one?
Well, again, the short answer is no. You do not have to have any kind of existing clients to begin with, and no need for an existing government client. So, no.
Okay, I have a personal question about a white paper. I recommend returning to us directly. Let's see what else we have here. Let's see, that's it. Okay, here's a question about grants.gov. Here, let me see it. I'm sorry, it's just small on the screen. That's also regarding whether or not you can put your thing directly onto grants.gov. Let's see. Any other questions? I think that's it. Yeah, one other question regarding foreign nationals. Yeah, like we mentioned before, companies do not have to be U.S. based, and nor do the researchers have to be research based. It depends on each grant is a separate case, but the majority of grants seem to be open to foreign nationals and for non-U.S. based companies. The exception is Small Business Innovation Research (SBIR), which is only open to companies that are U.S. based and which are of majority ownership of a U.S. citizen. I think that's it. How do you apply as a minority-owned business? That's part of the process. Uriel, do you want to take that one?
Well, in most cases, there's no special needs for that. Some grants actually are designed specifically for minorities or different groups, which means they limit other groups that do not fit that criteria from applying. So it actually makes it easier for you as a minority group to apply. But again, those are quite rare. In most cases, it doesn't matter or pose any significant additional steps.
Okay. The last question that I see here is, how would we work with you and on what terms? I recommend anybody who's interested in pursuing this further to reach out directly to me. I'll share my contact information at the end of the webinar. But the short answer is that we're a success-oriented company, and we're interested in partnering with companies that have a large chance of receiving high federal grants, because that's where our primary compensation comes from. So just a little bit more, and to take a quick summary here, there's a tremendous amount of money in federal grants. Pretty much every federal agency has a cyber budget, which splits up between procurement or contracts and R&D investments. Interesting to say that for companies that receive an R&D investment, usually those companies are first in line when it comes to receiving a federal contract. So should you want to have the federal government be one of your biggest clients, then that is an option that you'll have potentially on the table long term. Grants are non-dilutive, means that they don't dilute your control over your company, nor do they dilute your ability to receive revenue from your company, and they encourage you to maintain all IP. The pitfalls we mentioned, the difficult to identify the opportunities, and there's a low per submission success rate, and that seems what is turning most people away from approaching federal grants by themselves. Keys to success in our four-part formula is know the system, know as much as you can about the agency you're applying for a grant from, know your R&D roadmap, in other words, know yourself very well, and make the match for multiple high chance opportunities in order to engage in the fourth, which is a multiple submission strategy over the long term. We're happy to have you attend our upcoming webinar on funding beyond SBIR. I mentioned earlier that small business innovation research is a small portion of the pie for R&D grants. It's about roughly 3.2%, and the rest is in the form of broad agency announcements. You saw 3 examples of broad agency announcements today, and we mentioned also that they typically have much higher ceilings. That'll be on June 13th, 2018, so just later on, about a month and a little bit away. Oh, actually, just 2 weeks away. Sorry. On top of that, best way to reach out to us, should you be interested in pursuing federal grants together with Eagle Point Funding, is to reach me by email, josh@eaglepointfunding, or to take this link directly to my calendar and book yourself a time, which is good for you and good for us. And we're happy to continue the conversation. It's been great hosting you today. Eagle Point Funding is always happy to both provide information as well as to work with innovative companies going after non-dilutive funding and over the long term. That's it. Thank you, Oriel, for joining us. Thank you, everybody who was here today, and hopefully we'll be in contact soon.